And I also noticed that there's a bit of variety in how much history each of these acts has, right? Like a land value tax is something that I know our friend from Bloomington has been bringing up, year
Steve
after year.
Elkins.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
I thought you were going to say like there's a history there. It's Henry George was talking about it in the 19th century.
Okay, that's true too. Yes. Welcome to the Streets.mn podcast, the show where we highlight how transportation and land use can make our communities better places. Coming to you from beautiful Seward, Minneapolis, Minnesota, I am your host, Ian R. Buck. Another legislative session has come and gone in Minnesota, and it's time to recap what we accomplished and how things went. Let's start first by talking housing.
My name is Zach Udishtu. I use he, him pronouns, and I am currently the pro-housing advocacy coordinator at Sustain St. Paul.
And I'm Ivan Roberts, and I'm a volunteer with Neighbors for More Neighbors, and I was on the State Policy Task Force performing a wide variety of roles over the last legislative session.
Yeah, so this was a pretty exciting legislative session for me because I got to watch these organizations that traditionally were focused on their own respective cities. Sustain St. Paul and Neighbors for More Neighbors was in Minneapolis, shifting focus to doing statewide advocacy and trying to change the narrative and get some legislation passed at the state level. So let's do a quick kind of recap on what. And you guys were working pretty closely together, right? Yeah. What were our major goals for this session?
We had quite a range of major goals, and so just sort of speaking from Neighbors for More Neighbors perspective, about a year ago, we decided we're gonna take on some state stuff in the 2024 legislative session. Over last summer, summer 2023, we did what we called State Policy Summer Camp, where we organized every 2 weeks. Last fall, we polled our members. I mean, we had a meeting and we came up with 6 sort of key areas that we wanted to work on, which is obviously quite ambitious. One of those was the comprehensive plan clarity, which is sort of around the Minneapolis 2040 lawsuit. A couple of bills about allowing so second and third, a couple of bills about allowing more types of housing. One was missing middle, so that's your sort of duplexes through sixplexes approximately. Another one was transit-oriented development, which was essentially could we have state legislation for, taller 6 or more stories, closer to light rail and high-frequency bus transit, land value tax, single stair reform, and those were the sort of the key things that we were advocating for at the Capitol over the session.
Yeah.
A wide range of priorities.
And some of those are kind of the 2040 comprehensive plan is kind of an existential issue for Minneapolis in particular, but has implications for all other cities in the state. Zach, what were some of the priorities coming from the St. Paul side?
Yeah, we were pretty aligned with Neighbors for More Neighbors on that set of issues, similar things. And I think what put those issues at the forefront for us was it's a mix of things that St. Paul has already done. So, for example, getting rid of parking minimums, we've done that, and we've legalized 4 units or more on all of our residential lots. And so things that we've already done and that we would like to see spread throughout the rest of Minnesota. And then a couple of things that we can't do locally and that we needed state action on. So the comprehensive clarity bill and initiating a building code change to allow for single staircase buildings are required state action in a way that would enable better policymaking at a local level. So that's why we were targeting this kind of swath of policy stuff.
Yeah.
The tax one as well is one where the state has to pass the sort of enabling legislation to give cities the option to do a land value tax, and whether they do is then up to them. It's a little bit like your sort of sales taxes cities are, given the option to do sales taxes, but they levy them at different rates. And so, so again, that was one where there's this kind of interesting overlap of, you can't do anything without the state starting things. On the zoning side of things, like what you can do where, the state gave away in a very meaningful sense, like lots of its authority to cities about a century ago, and has essentially exercised very little oversight over them. So we were dealing with sort of very different situations with the different issues. The kind of the terrain on which we were discussing these things, varied a lot across those issues.
And I also noticed that there's a bit of variety in how much history each of these acts has, right? Like a land value tax is something that I know our friend from Bloomington has been bringing up, year
Steve
after
Elkins?
Yes.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say, like, there's a history there. It's Henry George was talking about it in the 19th century.
Okay, that's true too. Yes. But I have this kind of vague understanding that, like, hardly any bills ever pass the first year that they are introduced at the state. There's usually at least a couple of rounds of, like, people wrapping their heads around what this thing is and, bringing it back to their constituents and then coming back to this table with an actual, willingness to bargain on it, right?
Yeah, and I think, my sense of some of that dynamic relates to some sort of bigger, beyond housing issues in the way that our state politics are done, that we've got this pretty short legislative session for a state which is, pretty active in a wide range of activities. And people just don't have a lot of time to get acquainted with the topic. I think as we're sort of like recapping what happened, the people who were on the housing committees and sort of had a long time to get familiar with the bill became pretty supportive. And that was a really encouraging dynamic for people sort of not on the housing committees, and therefore sort of less acquainted with the issue. They didn't have as much time with it. And so I think that was part of the dynamic. This is something that I think happens to a lot of bills in a part-time, part of the year legislature like ours, is that there's just not enough time to have that sort of full process of discussion across a wide range of topics.
Yeah. And the part-time versus full-time legislature is that's a different conversation, but we are seeing some of the effects of it here, I'm sure. Okay, so I feel like we've kind of been talking around the topic. What are the things that we actually got passed, and which things were tabled for next year? Like, what are we dealing with here in the aftermath of the legislative session?
Zach, do you want to talk about one of them, and I'll talk about the other?
Sure, I'll take the single stair reform because. So that one is basically initiating a rewrite of the state building code to allow buildings that are taller than 3 stories to only have one staircase in them. And the status quo in Minnesota and a lot of other states in the United States is that taller than 3 buildings, you've got to have 2 staircases, and it takes up a lot of your floor space. It's really difficult to create buildings in already built out areas to put a new denser building in its place. It can lead to really inefficient use of floor space in a building. There's all kinds of challenges with it. And it's also not aligned with a lot of other countries and how they build and find ways to build buildings very safely, still keeping fire safety in mind, having better fire safety outcomes than the US. And so a couple of states, California and Oregon, have done similar things, initiating a study of the building code to move the wheels and figure out how to safely implement a policy where there can be taller buildings with only a single staircase. So that was one of our big couple of wins in this housing and land use space this session. Okay,
so what's the timeline that we're looking at for this study that's going to be conducted?
December 2025, I think, is the deadline for the 6-story sort of study, or the broader study. There is a process which is, I think, going to get underway where you can apply for a kind of a smaller change to the state building regulations, which would go up to allow up to 4 stories with a single staircase. And that could be done a little, because it's not as much of a change, could be done in a more expedited fashion. The comprehensive plan clarity or defense is a very it's a sort of the details are very Minnesota specific. The big picture is, I think, echoed in other states in the sort of way in which planning and environmental laws have interacted. So essentially, I mean, and this has been discussed as a kind of Minneapolis 2040, there's the lawsuit. The heart of the issue is this. The Metropolitan Land Planning Act essentially directs cities in the metro area to plan for growth. The Met Council says, like, we expect this many people are going to be coming into the metro area. We expect like they're going to be living in these areas, and cities have to plan. This is a kind of hidden, dirty secret. Like, cities are getting denser, and cities have to plan for that. Minneapolis did that in a particular way of allowing some quite sizable increases in sort of potential development capacity across the city. There's ways in which it's sort of been overstated. The number of units they calculate is different than the amount of actual floor space. That's a little smaller. On the other hand, there's this Minnesota Environmental Rights Act, and that allows any citizen to sort of take a private lawsuit against sort of state or private action if there's going to be an environmental impact. And so the contention in that was that comprehensive plans were litigable under MIRA. The judge at the district court level accepted that. They've been going back and forth. And so this gets to a sort of a tension between two laws that the legislature has passed, and interestingly enough, laws that were passed around the same time in the 1970s. The Comprehensive Plan Clarity Bill really just amends MIRA to say that planning for growth for population growth, as you're required to do essentially by this Metropolitan Land Planning Act, does not constitute action that is subject to action under the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act. What it means, getting back to the big picture, is that cities in the metro area can continue to plan for population growth. Say like, okay, we're expecting 5,000 people to move into Lakeville or Hugo or wherever, St. Louis Park, any city in the 7-county metro, and not be sued for the act of essentially saying like, you can put more housing in a particular place. And so that gives a lot of certainty to cities. Obviously, Minneapolis has been sort of the most under the gun with this, but I think it probably has had this effect on other cities.
Do cities outside of the metro ever do similar processes? Like do Duluth and Rochester do long-range planning of this sort?
Yeah, they also need to do comp plans, but the metro, because of the multiple jurisdictions and the sort of the greater overlap of the housing, transportation, all of the stuff that happens when you're functionally, a city of 3 million rather than 187 different municipalities. It's just much less of an issue in Rochester, in Duluth. I mean, the housing market in Rochester spills out of Rochester, but it spills out in a bit of a different way.
Right.
Into those sort of adjoining townships. And so, they've got their own issues, which they're dealing with, but it's not covered by this bill.
Oh, okay. The bill addresses obviously like anything going forward. Does it also just like cut off the current litigation that's happening?
It does, but it does it in a way which left a little room for plausible deniability on both sides. It said that the letter of the law was not like, and any lawsuit at the moment, it didn't say anything about the sort of the current actions. It did say that this applied to the most recent comprehensive plan submitted.
Okay.
And that was the 2020 round of comprehensive plans. And so, yes, the litigants do not seem to have recognized the letter of the law that it says it applies to the last round of comp plans. And I think they're, maybe they want something spelled out even further.
Sure.
There are legal fees for someone to collect. So there is in some incentive for some people in this whole situation to encourage the plaintiffs to keep on taking legal action. And maybe have a judge rule that when it says the last round of comp plans, like that actually means the one we've just been talking about.
So it sounds like the tail is wagging the dog.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of that going on.
All right, so we got a study for single stair. We got the 2040 comprehensive plan clarification. Did we get any other wins?
I think a big win was not on the.
I saw some shaking head from Zach and an enthusiastic yes from Ivan.
Yeah. I think those are good wins combined. They do allow sort of cities to keep on doing good things, and I think it's a good process with single stair. Kind of diffuses some of the opposition. A lot of other stuff got to committee hearings. The only one that didn't even get an introduction was the sort of transit-oriented development, which is your sort of towers near light rail, to paraphrase. But everything else, I think we were pleased with the hearings that the bills got, the conversation that was advanced, and it was disappointing the outcome.
Ian, you mentioned earlier, like a couple of these policies have been in some form proposed repeatedly the past few years. But I would say that this year was a really meaningful break from some of those past attempts in terms of the degree to which these issues both advanced through committees, but more generally got airtime, media coverage. Like these land use policies, just a lot of the big ones didn't pass, but they made progress in meaningful ways that haven't happened as much before. So we'd call that a win, even though it's not a direct policy win.
Yeah, I think they also did not get too sucked into like a partisan framework. We picked up sort of good Democratic and Republican support, and I think that's promising for future sessions. The coalition developed good relationships with the committee chairs in both the House and the Senate, and so I think that was a really positive development that sort of bodes well for continuing to talk about this going forward.
Speaking of the coalition, right? Especially the statewide upzoning bill. I saw that being framed in the context of like we have a very broad coalition, right? There's a lot of different groups coming from a lot of different backgrounds that were all supporting this bill, and so that was one that I was very surprised that it didn't make it to the finish line, given that from what I was seeing, the only opponents to it was like the League of Minnesota Cities.
Yeah, and there's also like the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, which is kind of like a for the small towns.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple of local government organizations. Yeah, I mean, they're pretty powerful at the Capitol. I think there's some sort of interesting dynamics politically in terms of like where our legislators come from.
That's more than just League of Minnesota Cities' own really effective lobbyist group, but also they do represent a lot of local elected leaders like mayors and council members in various cities, and that's a really powerful force with talking about the state representatives that represent people in those jurisdictions. If there is really strong opposition coming from mayors or planners in different cities and towns, that is potentially a really powerful force and a potentially difficult one to pass bills against.
Right.
It is sort of interesting, I think, to compare like to other policy areas where like in education, for example, we have a lot of local control, local school boards, local schools, but at a state level, the state sets like standards for how long the school year is and what we expect children to have learned by the time, in very precise ways. With housing, we've done, something quite different, which is like, here you've got this general grant of authority and you can do what you like with it. So there's a sort of very people are used to that. Whether it's the right sort of thing is an interesting question. But it's certainly like, the fact is like people are used to cities having this power and it being decided at that level.
So what are our plans for next year? What are we going to bring everything back to the table that we didn't get this year, or are we making any changes? I know not everybody's like settled on what we're going to be doing next year, but like, what do we anticipate?
I think early days, but I think we are talking the initial conversation amongst a lot of the coalition partners is that there was good solid momentum. I think one of the important things is the sort of polling done by Neighbors for More Neighbors, but also has been done by a range of organizations. Pew had a poll out last year. Zillow polls on these issues. Like housing reform along the lines that was proposed is broadly popular. And the sort of the challenge is like the people who sort of, think like, oh yeah, it'd be great for a fourplex to be allowed. You're not always thinking like, of your future self. And so it's sort of hard to articulate, whereas the people who are advocating like, I want to, me as League of Minnesota Cities, it's easier to articulate opposition.
Yeah, I think there will be some conversations, like, are there ways to get more suburban legislators on board? Are there ways to reduce the amount of opposition that local policymakers are whispering in their state representatives' ears? A lot of states have tried to pass these kinds of bills, and there's a lot of different ways for states to do statewide land use reform. There's a million details in which it can vary. And so I think at a high level, the goals are going to be pretty similar, finding ways to get more housing built in different areas and preventing places from saying no to housing in such systematic ways. But a lot of the policy details could vary, I think, for a future attempt.
If any of the listeners are interested in getting involved in this, when would be a good time to join Sustain St. Paul or Neighbors for More Neighbors?
Any time is a good time. There's probably a little bit of a fallow period right now in terms of the state work. But get involved, get to know the wonderful people in both organizations or either organization. And yeah, we'll find a role for anyone who wants to volunteer and work on this.
Yeah, I'll say maybe it's not the most active time to start getting right to work on state policy, but it's a great time to join for summer socials and meet people and organizations so that you are ready to plug in when the state session kicks back up again.
Zach, Evan, thanks for coming on.
Okay.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.
Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to record directly with every single organization that I wanted to get on this episode. The end of the school year kind of snuck up on me there. But thankfully, blogs exist, and organizations publish their own thoughts, and so I can read off some of those resources for you here on the episode. So first, we're going to take a look at what the Sierra Club had to say. First, I want to start with a quote here from Peter Wagenius, who is the Sierra Club North Star Chapter's legislative and political director. Let's see how good of a Peter impression I can do. Elections have consequences, and there's no greater proof than the accomplishments of this biennium. Between last year's victories, the 100% bill, the Omnibus Transportation Bill, and the Omnibus Environment and Energy Bill, the progress we have made in 2024 on land use reform and clean energy, I have never been more hopeful that we could finally do our part in Minnesota to address the climate crisis. All right, sorry, Peter, I don't think that's actually what you sound like. Anyway, so in addition to supporting a lot of the housing reforms that we were just talking about, Sierra Club also was focused on some energy-related stuff. So we have building decarbonization. The networked geothermal pilot explores climate-friendly heating and cooling solutions, offering opportunities to reduce carbon footprints and enhance energy efficiency. Clean energy permitting. So to accelerate the transition to clean energy, we need to speed up permitting of clean energy technologies like solar panels, wind turbines, and the electrical transmission grid. And some zero waste stuff. So the Packaging Waste and Cost Reduction Act was passed and will establish producer responsibility for packaging to reduce it upstream. We also have a couple of notes here on the climate impact of highways, which segues me into Our Streets' legislative summary. So Our Streets, formerly known as Our Streets Minneapolis, they published a post with a lot of stuff that they were working on. Our Streets lists the cumulative impacts for transportation bill, which did not pass this year, but they're going to be coming back to it in future years. The Community Preferred Alternative Act, which would give local communities more control over what MnDOT can do, what kinds of what highway projects look like in their communities. This one also is still listed as in progress. Strengthening greenhouse gas protections for major highway projects. This one passed. So in 2023, we had a law that required MnDOT to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on new highway projects, but the way the law was written, it only applied to highway expansion projects. And so now in 2024, we have closed that loophole. Now that those greenhouse gas emissions reduction rules apply to all highway projects. Reforming speed limit implementations. This one was about aligning MnDOT's practices with the newly published Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which has a lot of good new stuff about guidelines about street design and speed limit implementations. Another in-progress item is defining highway purposes to include all modes of transportation. So this is related to the earlier item that I mentioned where we have, as part of our greenhouse gas emissions mitigations, MnDOT is being required to allocate funds towards walking, biking, transit-related stuff, right? Those can be parts of their mitigation projects. But the way that the state constitution is currently written, a lot of the money that MnDOT has access to has to go towards trunk highway purposes. And so this bill would clarify that trunk highway purposes includes any mitigation efforts that they have to go to, right? Including allocating funds towards walking, biking, and transit. Asphalt Art Pilot Program. So if you've ever seen like a crosswalk area or like an intersection that has a bunch of art painted on it, those kinds of things are currently not really allowed in Minnesota in most contexts. And so this bill, which is still in progress, they're going to be looking to add more authors to it next year, is to allow that kind of thing to happen. Studying a regional bike share program is also in progress. This would be really cool because here in the Twin Cities, we have a very disjointed system where each municipality is it's up to them to allow contracts with private companies like Lime or VO or whoever else, and having one unified bike share system would be pretty awesome. And vehicle weight regulation, this one's also in progress. So this would be collecting fees on dangerously heavy or oversized vehicles and using the revenue to increase funding for existing pedestrian safety and safe routes to schools programs. That's everything that Our Streets has written on their blog post. Let's shift our focus now to some bike-related stuff. I got to catch up with Michael Wojak, Executive Director of the Bicycle Alliance of Minnesota. We did get to chat while we were at a brewery, so apologies for all of the background noise in this next section, but we've got a lot of good information coming your way. Remind us briefly, what was Bicycle Alliance of Minnesota going for this year?
We had one bill that had a number of different items incorporated in it, but there were really 3 areas that we were pushing to accomplish. The first was updating driver education standards about the responsibility of a driver around a vulnerable road user. Now, you might think there'd be something in there already about that. Nope, there wasn't. And this is basically going to ensure that as people are getting driver education, they understand what their responsibilities are around vulnerable road users, bicyclists, pedestrians, those who roll scooters, but also on motorcycles, which, as it turns out, due to a federal definition, is not a vulnerable road user.
Okay.
Yeah. And it turns out including them in our state definition would have created a lot of chaos. So if you actually look at our bill, it always says around a vulnerable road user or a motorcyclist.
That's great.
So
yeah.
the things you learn. The second part of the 3 is there's a lot of evolving technology around e-bikes, and one of the issues is if we don't come up with good regulation, we're going to get bad regulation.
Right.
And we did a number of things to clarify what is and is not an e-bike and make sure that we have a best in the nation kind of understanding of e-bike legislation. And then the last is the last few years, the state has done a number of things to quantify complete streets and institute that at a MnDOT level. But a missing piece was that a lot of times these complete street discussions, and I'm sure your listeners know that complete streets is really accounting for the needs of all the users as you design a roadway.
Yeah.
Well, what was happening is the design speeds were being set, the infrastructure was being designed, and then after all of that was done, they figured out how they could accommodate other uses. And you can imagine the outcomes weren't very good.
Right.
And now it's all points of the design process, complete streets have to be considered, including when the initial design speeds for projects are set. And that's going to mean a lot of lives saved.
Okay, yeah. So what happened? What did we accomplish?
Well, first and foremost, I can say my first session being involved with the legislature quite like this, it was interesting in the most Minnesotan way possible. But this session was truly chaotic. I mean, especially at the end. You know it's going to be a challenge when, one party is in control, but there's a 1-vote majority. Mm-hmm. That's a tough place to start out with, and then...
I mean, that's the same situation we were in last year, though, and, last year it was just boom, 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 things were getting done.
And, I've thought a lot about what was different about this year, and I would say there are really 2 things that were different about this year. One, some of these folks are heading into an election cycle, which they weren't last year.
Okay.
And, the second thing is when one of the majority party gets charged with felony charges.
Yeah.
There's been no criminal proceedings or anything yet, so in theory you're innocent until proven guilty. But that doesn't mean you're not going to have a bunch of ridiculous filibustering going on.
Sure.
And I think that was the difference this year.
Okay, yeah. But and that didn't happen until well into the legislative session. Yeah.
It was maybe 3 or 4 weeks to go in the session when it happened, but the reality is the wheels fell off.
Right.
It was
and I
chaos.
guess that's kind of the crucial time because over the course of a session, there's a lot of hearings and procedures and changing what exactly the bill says as we get approach an actual vote. And so a lot of that was still in process when we kind of got derailed.
And that was one of the challenges I think everyone faces, especially your first time going through this. Fortunately, I have Dorian, the founding executive director of Bike MN, who's a tremendous mentor and willing to help out the whole way. But
you still let him come around?
We haven't changed the locks yet, but no, I actually think that he's more likely to block my phone number than me locking him out. So Dorian was a friend long before I took this position, and he encouraged me to apply for it, even though I was grossly underqualified. In hindsight, going back and reading that job description, everyone in the world was grossly underqualified, so I just fit right in. But he helped with the legislative piece quite a bit because he had some experience with this. And what you don't realize on the outside coming in is just the language that you use in your bill determines what committees you're going to go to. And when you have a very tight schedule like you had this year, the reason so many organizations struggled and their bills didn't make it to the finish line is because they had to get to committees where they just couldn't get a hearing. And we were able to make it to all of our committees. We were approved. We got into the transportation omnibus bill in both the House and the Senate. We made it through the conference committee. We actually had to change the language in the House and the Senate to meet certain rules obligations and certain concerns that might have existed in that particular chamber. But in the end, we had a good compromise out of the conference committee, and it did pass and become law, so we were successful this year.
Okay, so all three parts that you named, we got them.
For better or for worse, I'm probably setting myself up for future disappointment, but yeah, first time out, everything we hoped to accomplish in our bills we were able to do this year.
Nice. All right. It would be nice to let you breathe for a moment, but I want to ask, what are we thinking about for future years?
Yeah, I do think there are a lot of exciting items coming up, and I've mentioned in other conversations with you that I care a lot about local advocacy as well, and to the extent that we can do local advocacy, I think that's important. We also, again, we are a organization that loves to partner, and we're not only looking out for our success, we want to see organizations like Our Streets, Movement, Neighbors for More Neighbors. We want to see all these organizations being successful as well, and they had some great bills this year that didn't make it to the finish line.
Yeah.
As an organization that wants people to be able to bike, walk, and roll safely, it's important that we give them a place where they can live, that they can bike, walk, and roll safely.
No kidding.
And there were some great land use reforms that didn't make it to the finish line this year. And I really think that is coming. I think that some of the organizations that tried to stop that progress this year, the different cities organizations, Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, League of Minnesota Cities, they need to step up because they see the freight train is coming. There were some pretty diverse Democrats and Republicans that were passionate about creating more housing options and reducing parking bureaucracy.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. I mean, you had groups like ours and Our Streets working with the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah.
Everyone understands housing is a huge issue. The laws that we have in place, particularly through local governments, are ridiculous and they're preventing progress. Now, Minneapolis and St. Paul are far ahead of others, but statewide, this is a huge issue. It needs reform. And that's got to be for our organization and every organization that cares about these issues. That is a huge issue going forward.
Yeah. Do we have any appetite for tackling right turns on red? That's always my pet, project.
And that's interesting too, because I've always been a Greater Minnesota person. I've lived in Greater Minnesota most of my life, and I think that it's going to be something that's going to face a lot of opposition unless we make it context sensitive. And the reason for that is if you live in a big city with a lot of heavy traffic making left turns, where there are people who are biking, walking, rolling, that is something that should be addressed. Now, if I go up to Aiken County in northern Minnesota and there's one stoplight in the entire county, and that stoplight maybe sees 5 bicyclists a year, telling people that they can't turn right on red there is just going to create a lot of opposition from the legislators up there. So if I were dictator for a day, I'm fine with let cars wait, no right turn on red. I also want to see us be able to get this to the finish line.
Right.
So maybe there's some compromised language. And though you didn't exactly ask it, we did pass the Idaho stop last year, or the stop sign as yield. We do need to get to the point, too, where we can treat stoplights in the same way. And that's another battle that we're going to have to fight over time.
And we're already partway there, There's the law that, a cyclist, if you're waiting at a stoplight and you have a reasonable suspicion that, that you have to, wait for an entire cycle or something, but who knows how long that is, so,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I like to say I'm a very suspicious person in those circumstances.
Yeah. Right. I think part of the key for laws like that is making sure that, it is at the discretion of the vulnerable road user to determine, what is the best course of action, which is, part of the language that was adopted for, I think this was last year, with the Bill Dooley Bicycle Safety Act. Yeah.
Yeah, it's and a key part of that is we used to have language like the cyclist has to ride as far to the right as possible or practicable.
Yeah.
And really now it's as far to the right as they feel safe, because sometimes the right place for a cyclist is to take the center of the lane and make sure no car can pass because it's not safe to do so.
Right. Yeah, exactly. What was your favorite moment of this legislative session? Were there any like standout like things that stick in your memory?
I was really proud of Minneapolis on being able to move forward on the video speed enforcement.
Oh, right.
And that was there was a lot of opposition to that. It ended up being, I think, reduced to just like Minneapolis and Mendota Heights, because they happened to have a police officer that came and spoke. But it's the reality is it's probably one of the simplest things when you have poorly designed infrastructure, which we have all over the state. It's probably one of the easiest interventions that make a meaningful difference. Mm-hmm. Now, it also irritates a lot of people, because if you're speeding or running red lights, you're going to get nailed for it.
Oh no!
Yeah.
There are consequences for your actions?
You know, it's going to be a new experience for some folks for sure.
Yeah.
But but there are some concerns, and I know a partner organization of ours, Our Streets, is afraid about disproportionate policing with that.
Sure.
And I do think there's some good language in there to make sure that the deployment of this technology is done in such a way that is racially and economically equitable. I think that getting that camel's nose under the tent is a good way of starting the process. I think this is something that's going to become statewide. In my previous life, when I was on a city council here in Rochester, we tried for decades to be able to let cities lower speed limits, and we could never get it done. So what we finally did is we applied that cities of the first class, those with 100,000 or more, or Duluth, because Duluth is special, could they could do this.
Hang on, you sound salty about this. that Duluth gets special treatment.
Duluth, well, I will say that a little bit salty, because they definitely get special treatment from the legislature, but also a little jealous, for sure. And Duluth is just amazing. We love them, and we've got a new chapter starting out there. But they. Once the cities of the first class were able to set their own speed limits, then everyone else is like, hey, wait a minute. Why can't our town do that? Why is it just the big cities? We want to be able to do that too. And, 1 or 2 years later, everyone can set their own speed limits, and we're all a lot safer for it.
Nice. Yeah. Well, Michael, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah. I love to talk, right? Thanks for having me, and it's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Streets.mn podcast. The show is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Non-Derivative license, so feel free to republish the episode as long as you are not altering it and you're not profiting from it. The music in this episode is by Eric Brandt and the Urban Hillbilly Quartet. This episode was hosted and edited by me, Ian R. Buck. We're always looking to feature new voices on the Streets.mn podcast, so if you have ideas for future episodes, drop us a line at podcast@streets.mn. Streets.mn is a community blog and podcast and relies on contributions from audience members like you. If you can make a one-time or recurring donation, you can find more information about doing so at streets.mn/donate. Find other listeners and discuss this episode on your favorite social media platform using the hashtag StreetsMNPodcast. Until next time, take care.